This is the Critical Conversations podcast, a KPOV special project developed to feature unique perspectives and the courage it takes to go there, challenge mundane thought, and question the norm.
Welcome, Gay.
No, thank you for having me here.
Will you tell our listeners about the Institute, the center, and what all you do there? It's amazing, actually.
The Karula Center for Nonviolence was established in 2008 in response to the work that I had done in identifying and diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in free-living elephants in South Africa. And the field of looking at non-human animals as psychological beings was a new concept. A neuroscientist, of course, uses, and psychologists use animals in their experimentation based on that tacit assumption. However, openly, looking at animals, understanding and studying them has been from a behavioral ethological. So because of the interest and the importance of people realizing that elephants and other animals are psychological and vulnerable to human violence was really startling. And so that's why we started the Karula Center as a way to really bring attention to the fact that animals, and I would now, since, with plants, are sentient beings. And they share the same capacities as we do, if not more. But definitely we share the capacities of thinking and feeling and dreaming and aspirations and everything like that. So essentially, the Karula Center started as a research and education institution. And we began offering courses and internships, which we still have. And also then what rolled into that was a sanctuary rescue. And that really, so we are really rooted in the concept of rescue and sanctuary. And it really got precipitated. This is land of my family's and who's lived here for 70 some years. And it was responsive to someone, dumping a rabbit in our front yard. And so we took the rabbit in, and so we started rescuing rabbits. And then I was contacted by a research agency. They had, so many desert tortoises. The lab was closing, and they were going to kill the tortoises who could not be reintroduced into the wild. And so these were special needs. They had lost an arm or a leg, or had been abused in some fashion by humans. So they asked me if I would take the tortoises. And like I said, I always say that, mouth moves faster than brain. And I said, yes. So we had to scramble. We did all the analysis, is it going to be okay? Because this is in the Southwest, where the tortoises come from is in the Southwest United States, very different climatic and physiographic terrain. So we built 5 geodesic domes, and anyway, so we brought them in, and we've expanded. Not huge. We've also rescued farmed animals, turkeys and chickens, and now we have a sulcata in addition to our desert tortoises. And the desert tortoises are endangered. So
tell us, what is a sulcata?
A sulcata tortoise is from Africa originally. And as with a lot of exotic animals, they become kind of a rave. So people buy these little, are usually captive bred, and they say, wow, this is great. And then the sulcata starts to grow up. And this is, again, very much like what happens to all exotics. And the people get bored, or they don't feel like they can handle the animal, etc. And so they need rescuing. So the sulcata was a very popular, and I think still is, exotic animal, but they grow very large, like up to 100 and even more pounds.
Oh.
And unlike the desert tortoises who brumate, which is the reptile word for hibernation, our tortoises brumate for approximately 5 to 6 months a year. The sulcata does not, and they require very high temperatures all the time.
So are they hibernating during the winter?
The tortoises begin their brumation usually late fall and continue to the spring. And we figure out, we weigh them and we soak them and we weigh them during that time and to see if they're losing too much weight too fast. If that is happening and reaches a certain threshold, then we pull them out and we gradually warm them. They're ectotherms. And when they first came here, we had to do that to several because they were in very, very poor shape. This year has been very difficult because we've had such we have a severe drought here. It still hasn't rained one day. And the weather has been extremely erratic. And they typically respond to a shift and begin the path to brumation when there's a shift in the light. It's less temperature than it is light, but of course there is a temperature threshold.
What exactly do they do? Do they just go into their shell?
Well, the geodesic domes, we have we call little carports for them during the warm months where they go in, and they also have burrows, which are very fortified. And so when they begin to start to shift in the season, they slow down, they don't want to eat so much, and they spend more time in their burrow. And so it's kind of it's a judgment call in terms of that. We could keep them in there because they're all compromised in some way. We bring them out, we put them in cardboard boxes with hay, and then we have a special room for them that is temperature controlled and humidity controlled. And that's where we monitor them during the year to make sure that they're not losing weight too fast.
Interesting. Tell us a little bit about the personalities of these tortoises.
They're extraordinary. I think that's true with every individual, whoever you're with. But they're extremely engaging. They love to engage with humans and other turtles and other animals. And they are very distinct personalities. Of course, they've had very distinct biographies, of their experiences and all. Again, as I said, many of them have lost an arm. They've been chewed by a dog. They've lost an arm, their shell has been chewed on, or they've been, one tortoise was held in a closet for 5 years. And they're just very extraordinary. They're incredibly intelligent and sensitive and very open and profound, absolutely profound. But their ages are roughly, they're kind of like tree rings, because or trees, that, like when you have trees that are on top of a mountain, they are much older than what you might think because they're small, because of the wind and the elements. And so because of that, we really don't know their ages by their size or whatever because they have been in compromised situations. But they range in about between maybe now 10 and in their 80s.
What other animals do you have at the sanctuary?
We have the desert tortoises, the sulcata tortoise, and turkeys. And these are rescued domestic turkeys and rescued domestic rabbits and chickens. And we also, as best we can, serve as a refuge for the wildlife who are endangered and under tremendous, tremendous stress. They have nowhere to go. As I said, we have a very, very bad drought. They have no browse. And they have no water in general. And when they do have those things, that they're in a very they're populated with people. So we also have a lot of hunting that goes on. So we try as best we can. We put out, I buy greens, loads and loads of greens from them, from the co-op, collard greens and all, so that they have something that is, that has the vitamins. We put out water and some other food because they're not just the deer. We have puma and bear and raccoons and skunks and possums. So we try to, create a place of security for them and rest and these kind of basic elements as much as we can.
I do that too where I live, but I don't have near the area you do. But we do have raccoons and deer and sometimes skunks and lots of birds and things like that. I sometimes wonder if I'm doing the right thing to feed them, because we're always told not to feed them. But you must feel differently. You must have a different view of that.
There is a desire, and I wrote a book called Carnivore Minds in 2017 with Yale, which really focuses on pumas and orcas and all the loathsome creatures, like grizzly bears, etc., rattlesnakes. And when you really dig into it, and again, Charlie Russell, which I'll talk about that book later, and Charlie in particular, most of the regulations that come from the agencies, the wildlife agencies and enforcement agencies, are myth. There is no foundation. So when you really look at it, and it's not just me, we're talking about people like Charlie Russell, Charlie Vandergogh, Enos Mills, this is yours. For example, grizzly bears, they rarely harm a human. If they do, it's because they feel extremely threatened, or they're somehow seriously compromised, like they're very old and have no food. And yet they're pictured as these dangerous maniacs. Now, subsequent, after years and years and years, decades and decades, hundreds of years of being persecuted, all pumas, bears, they've suffered, trauma. In fact, when you speak to someone from the agency or whatever, like Charlie used to talk about, when there was a dead bear who was shot, it was not unusual to find multiple bullets, not from the lethal incident, but rather from previous being shot at. So in probably every single bear has either been shot at, been wounded, or witnessed their mother being shot or someone that they knew being shot. And that's basically how they live. They live in a war zone. So the idea of not feeding is really, it's a myth in the sense of the animals. I'll tell you, for example, the wild turkeys, we put out food for them. And if, it's expensive. And, I'll be sitting out there, and if they don't need it, then they don't come around. They go after grasshoppers or bugs, or they take their beaks and they strip off in the field the grains. So animals, make their own living, but we have changed their habitat by constantly noise. There's, people, even mountain bikes, it's interfering. It's very threatening to have a human. A human could be carrying a gun. That's their experience. So they really have no safety, and they don't have any browse. People have taken over their land. They've driven out, for example, they'll drive out with cattle. They drive out the deer and the wolves, and puma don't have anything to eat. So that's when you'll get a kill of a sheep or something, because they don't have their natural habitat. So the myth of not feeding, they won't eat. I'm just telling you my experience. They won't eat something unless they need to. And there's a whole, I would call it propaganda, like, don't get close to wildlife, And the reason why is, there's psychological, I go into my book, but a large part of it has to do with if we have empathy with our animal kin, does create empathy and sympathy, and the agencies are funded largely by hunting.
Yeah.
So then there's all these stories and myths made up about rabies and stuff, and that is true. There are rabies and there are distemper and things like that, but relatively speaking, it's minor. I mean, it's not that you should be stupid about it. It's just that we really need to start looking at our animal kin, as refugees in need. They are refugees in need.
It's a huge issue. I mean, those of us who realize these and understand these facts, but the majority of people simply don't. And there seems to be a lack of concern for disrupting any sort of, what shall I say, typical farming. So that's how they rationalize killing the wild animals. I mean, I think this is such a noble task that you've taken on, but it's huge. It's just huge. I mean, I think Judy and I both have encountered, having conversations with people, trying to get them to appreciate wild animals. And they're just, it's like, Yeah, we love to see them when we hike, but if they're killing, something we want to eat, then they should be killed. It's very frustrating. So how do you perceive this all changing?
Well, I think it is changing. I mean, that's our organization, and in fact, we're really sort of, it feels like we're constantly redirecting because things are changing in the world. But, is to try to get the word out in terms of the myths. And it's really hard. I mean, even me talking about now of putting out food is somewhat on the line, will be perceived as being on the line. And, I might be the target of an investigation of breaking the law. I mean, you have things like, for example, and if you look at my Carnivore Minds book, it talks about how the agencies have all these, on their websites, right? The wildlife agencies in different states, how to bait a bear, and you bait a bear and you shoot it, right? That's how you get a bear. And this is not just me. I'm talking about there are sites of people who have put out food for bears because the bears are needy, and they're put in jail or they're fined and vilified. So right. Because they do the same thing as baiting, except they don't kill the bear. So and other animals, same thing with deer. So and in my book, I give specific examples of individual humans who have suffered terribly and have been persecuted by the agencies and the government for basically just being friends and neighbors with animals. So how do I see this changing? I think that now with all of these extreme changes in the world, people are hopefully becoming a much more appreciated. Now, Joni Mitchell said, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone." Well, it's going. The deer are going, the bears are going, the raccoons are going, and I'm just speaking of here in Oregon. And the birds are going. And if you don't think that's true, you better look around because they are going. And it's going to be very, very lonely. Not only that, you'll get further breakdown and it'll cause more problems for us. So how do I see it changing? Just by putting out the word. The book I wrote, Carnivore Minds, is rather technical. I did that because I needed to be able to show a strong scientific rationale and foundation for the assertions that I was making. So things like neuropsychology and neurosciences, it's very well established that all animals, and now it looks like plants, have these capacities that we do. For trauma, for feelings, emotions, relationships, etc. And so that's why that's what I was saying, and sort of debunking it, and not sort of, but debunking the myths, which are deep in science and deep in the agencies, and all for psychological and economic reasons. There was a scientist who was maintaining that, like killing an elephant is murder. And killing an orca or putting an orca in an aquarium is terrible and violation of basic rights. But it's okay to eat fish. And it's okay to kill deer because they don't have feelings and relationships like those other animals. And this is a scientist who's saying it. And this is a scientist who's read my books. Oh, no. And it's not the stuff that I do, it's not really original. I put all the existing science together. That's what I did, and opened my mouth. So I drew from neurosciences and psychology, which are the hard sciences, and said, this is all the biomedical models. For example, the animals who are used in experimentation brutally. These are cats, these are mice, these are octopuses. They're, you name it. And they wouldn't be using them as subjects for the purpose of understanding humans and finding things for drugs and disease for humans, mental as well as physical, unless they had the same stuff that we do. So we have this tacit culture of recognizing that we all have the same brains and feelings and capacities across species, but it's never open. And it's still, even though people who are quote unquote animal advocates don't go that far. A lot of them, they don't do that. So, what we try to do and encourage other people, and I'm trying to write some more, less techno-academic-y kind of things, that lays the foundation, the legitimacy, if you believe in science. So our science that we believe in and that say that informs our society and informs our policy says that the animals we look at and the trees are just different on the outside, but they're really the same on the inside. And when I say the same on the inside, that means that they have the same kind of, cogs and wheels and capacities that we do. They obviously have a very different ethical system, just like the Native Americans who were subjected to genocide by white colonials in this country. They have a different ethic. They are part of nature, and they're respectful of nature, and they understand that.
In your book, Elephants on the Edge, you talk quite a bit about the emotions of elephants, and it's really fascinating, the examples that show that they have these emotions, the whole, as you put it, the whole rainbow of emotions. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like, I was really fascinated by that they recognize the clothes that people who hurt them wear and people who don't hurt them wear, and the mirror and all of that.
Clothes thing is researchers in Africa, in Amboseli, and they noticed that the elephants responded very differently, again, to those who were not hunters and those who were, or, that's been experiments with other animals. And I think it's the first chapter in Elephants on the Edge, I described this elephant called Happy. And there is a campaign right now run by the Non-Human Personhood Project, headed by Steve Wise, that is trying to get her out of the Bronx Zoo. And she was one of the individuals. They hooked up this, not Steve, this is other people, researchers. They hooked up this big mirror, and they have this very strict protocol to see whether she and the other elephants could recognize themselves, like touching, a spot on her head. So they've done that experiment with chimpanzees and dolphins and various things. And sometimes an individual shows that they recognize themselves, and some individuals don't. In my opinion, it's a stupid thing. I mean, it just shows the bias of, one, why do we care? I mean, I hardly look in the mirror, which you probably can tell. I mean, when I say stupid, it's like, oh my God, it's like so culturally, really? These are adults doing these kinds of experiments? I mean, why? So, and you see the elephants, and if you listen, and this is something that Charlie Russell and really sensitive people who are very cognizant, Daphne Sheldrick, who passed a few years ago, who founded the David Sheldrick Trust in Kenya. Daphne's extraordinary, and I quoted her, every time I would write something, I would always share it with people who had spent a lot of time. And Daphne was number one, Carol Buckley was another. But Daphne really had a very, she was a healthy, normal, loving person, did not have any agenda other than supporting the elephants and helping these orphaned elephants recover from trauma in some fashion, and try to restore and to nurture the elephant society, which is very, very sophisticated. So as I always say, a question here is that if we all have the same, brain structures and processes, and I'm not the only one that says that, it's all verified in neurosciences and psychology. If we all have the same structures and processes and capacities, why don't the animals do to us what we do to them? They certainly can. And elephants do kill people. That's under severe, severe trauma. There, in the Carnivore Minds, there's a woman, oh gosh, no, I don't remember her name, extraordinary. It's in the alligator crocodile thing. And she was from Australia. And she was an environmentalist, very sensitive. And she was out paddling, and she wasn't, like a tourist out there. She knew it. And the park guy said, be sure you don't go down this thing or whatever. Anyways, they have what they call saltwater crocodiles, and humans are on the menu. It just is, And so she's realized halfway down, I went down the wrong channel. And lo and behold, she was encountered a crocodile, and the crocodile encountered her, tossed her over, and she proceeded to sustain what they call death rolls, where the crocodile holds the could be a deer or, antelope or a person. In this case, it was her, held her, and then, rolls with the attempt, I guess it is, to drown the prey. And so she sustained that 3 times. It was extraordinary. She was injured. She managed to get to shore, and was saved, which is, again, extraordinary. Anyway, she wrote about it. Beautiful. And she said, while she was going through this, it's kind of like a Woody Allen thing. I saw my life flash before my eyes, but it wasn't my own. She said, my feeling was outrage. I think that was the word she used. What? Me? Food? I mean, what's going on here? I'm me. I'm a human. You don't eat me. And so she wrote about that, and she talked about that concept of human privilege, where, we hold ourselves up, even her, who's an extraordinary, profound, very deep, philosophically examining person. We have this assumption of well, we don't die, we're not supposed to be someone's food. And that's really the barrier, this very implicit, that's kind of a reaction I could relate to. I'm a nice person. Why would you want to eat me? So anyways, that's kind of, my opinion is that science needs to be science of the heart. And we need to disable this human privilege and start listening. And start understanding how to be animals, how to be nature, because nature runs on a very non-violent agenda. Everyone says it's so tooth and red and claw. It's not. And in fact, in the Charlie book, Talking with Bears, Conversations with Charlie Russell, he talks about that, how this one incident where he used to live in Alberta and in the woods. And so he saw these deer radiating out while he was on a walk. And he went, investigated, and he saw there was a cougar, puma, that had killed one of the deer recently and was pulling it into an area, kind of a safe place to start eating. And what he found striking was that the rest of the herd was just about 100 or some meters away, and they'd stopped and they were eating. And so he told this to a biologist, and she said, well, that's because they don't feel, just like I said earlier, that's because they don't feel anything. And so, Charlie, but we had conversations about this because I had a similar experience. And the point is that when they do feel grief. I mean, I've seen it, and other people have seen it up close in rattlesnakes. There's a chapter on that. But they're not like us. They got to keep going. They've got to keep eating, and it's not traumatic in the way of our violence to animals because it's expected. It's not fun. No one wants to die, but it's expected in kind of the formula of nature. So everything settles back into a peace again. Cougar needs to eat, go on. So that's very different than our present dominant human psychology. And it's not violent. I mean, violent technically, if you look it up in the dictionary, it is violent, but not violence like the way we do it. This is not violence. That's why I also say our Guerrilla Center for Nonviolence is because the animals are not violent. They do their job and they leave. I mean, that's it. And they do it because they have to do it. I don't know why they're carnivores, but they're carnivores. That's the way they, evolved. But that's part of their job, and that's how they live.
So I know that you've done a lot of work on determining that certain animals have PTSD, correct? Mm-hmm. And I can see where it would be fairly obvious in a captive animal. But how do you determine that with a wild animal? And is there any recourse to help them overcome that?
Let me just say a little bit about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a technical diagnosis. And complex PTSD is typical. When you look in the DSM, which is the psychology kind of Bible, that has everything listed and all things. And PTSD was the only diagnosis that was not generated intrapsychically. That is to say, if I go into a therapist and, they always, for insurance, have to write down the number and do the diagnosis, right? even if some therapists don't really believe in it. So, I go in there and they see my symptoms and I talk about this and they'll say, major anxiety or depression or whatever, right? And it could be correlated, like, my mother died or I lost my job or, something like that. But it's never understood someone caused it. With trauma, PTSD, there's an implicit agent who causes it. It's not just in my mind. It has to do with it was caused by someone on the outside or something that was experienced. And it's kind of famous. I think it's Sandra Bloom, who's a psychiatrist, coined this. I'm not sure. But trauma, the realization of trauma and what that was, changed the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So PTSD has had a very sort of turbulent history, and it continues to. Looking in the history, a Roman general described some of his men as having his soldiers as having these symptoms. But it really came to the fore with during and after World War I. Shell shock, it was called shell shock. And it was very humiliating, and it was hidden because, that the people were cowards and all of that. Then, of course, there was Second World War, and it kind of was unavoidable. You had the concentration camps, you had, the veterans, you had people who were civilians that had sustained terrible things like bombing, et cetera, and death. So essentially, the PTSD, people started really studying it. Bessel van der Kolk was one of the earlier ones. He's a psychiatrist, and he was working with the Dutch resistance, I think it was, during Second World War. And then, of course, there were the Holocaust survivors, very severe, and that really sort of deepened the study and looking at how trauma passes across generation, transmits across generations. So then the neurosciences kicked in and started. That was like psychology and psychiatry, but then neurosciences became a very strong field, and a lot of research was in there looking at affective, all of that kind of stuff, how it affects the brain, etc. Then the Vietnam War. So anyways, it's had a very tumultuous kind of thing because a lot of people didn't want to go there. That's a story unto itself. But when you have a diagnosis, a lot of times, if with that phrase, what happened to you? In other words, if you know what happened to a person, whether they're saying it verbally or like the young elephants in Africa that started my work in this, we knew, looking at their history, they were orphaned when helicopters came down and massacred their family. And then they were grabbed. They saw their family and their mother killed, dead. These were babies, like babies. And then they were grabbed and tied often to the bodies of their family. Then they were brought into trucks, translocated, brought to a place that was not their home. There were parks that they were trying to repopulate in South Africa, in this particular case, to build up the populations which had been decimated. And they were preparing for ecotourism in the fact that now apartheid was going to be completing, and that people would start to come back, which they did. So these young elephants suffered a series of trauma. So it was really complex trauma. All of these things I named. They didn't have a family to nurture them, which means if you are thinking about the brain as a model, a heuristic, the brain is shaped, informed, all the synapses and everything like that, your emotions, your definition of what is real, and what is normal. Mothers and family, they're in a unit of the family unit with all their siblings and cousins and aunties. That's the kind of the nucleus of elephant society. And then these young males didn't have that. So it's not just what happened to them, but what they didn't have. And they didn't have this second phase of socialization, which is with older bulls. So they stay with their family. and until like they're 10, 12. It depends, 10 between 9 and 12, depending where and when the circumstance. And they're either kicked out or they leave and they join an all bull group or area. And they are mentored in the same way from the brain. In other words, they start to mature just like human children. And they do that within this elephant society. And it's important to understand that it's the shaping of the emotions in the brain and what constitutes knowledge and normality and how to respond. And they remain really under the wing of this tutelage of these older bulls until like they're 30. And that's when become sexually mature. And then they start going into must and start, looking for gals. And so these elephants had nothing like that whatsoever, nothing. So when you look at their history, which is what I went looked at their biography, it just fell out. In other words, you're halfway there at understanding what happened to them without even knowing their symptoms. In many cases, if you hear the story of someone who's experienced thing, you don't even have to even know the symptoms. In fact, but they did show symptoms. They sexually assaulted rhinos, they killed rhinos, and subsequent to that, my research also showed when I investigated it that mothers were neglecting their babies, males were killing males, never happens. There was infanticide, never happens in the wild, never. So all the neurosciences and neuropsychology, given the input, what I told you, what they experienced, predicts symptoms of trauma. And if they don't, that's the interesting part, right? It's like, if they don't show those things, it's like, wow. But that's really the case. So back to that was a long story, but try to give you the background for it. So, for example, the grizzly bears that Charlie was encountering in Upper Washington Glacier National Park in Alberta, Waterton. I mean, he grew up there his whole life. He never carried bear spray, never carried a gun after a teenager, never. And he started carrying bear spray, like he says, when I remember. He was a very seasoned, smart person. He spent his whole life trying to understand, not study, trying to understand bears. So he was very perceptive. But basically, they're all traumatized because of the way they're treated. They're shot. They don't have their food. When they come out of hibernation, the bears, as you mentioned, they come out of hibernation. Typically, for grizzly bears, they would have a dead bison, buffalo. But the colonials and the farmers and the cattlemen shoot them all. And they drove them out just like they drove out the First Nation people. So a grizzly needs that pulse, and the children need that pulse of calories because they're basically depleted from a long hibernation. And so they might kill a cow because they don't have their usual, traditional kind of thing. But they're all traumatized because they've been shot at. The children of orphaned are traumatized by trauma transmission. Okay, and trauma transmits by neurobiologically through stress hormones, right? And it also from experience and social interaction. So if you meet a traumatized bear, it throws everything off kilter. And so it's easy. I say that all the animals around here are traumatized. It's amazing that more animals don't, quote unquote, act out. But you have to realize, like when you have an elephant that kills someone, whether it's free living elephant or free living bear or one in a zoo, it's because of trauma. I mean, it's the same with us. The elephants in zoos they've been taken as babies typically. They're tortured. They call it training. It's tortured. They don't have their mother. They've been taken. It's horrible. And they live in a prison. The climate's not right. Think about it. And something that really, really is important. Non-human animals have very, very deep relationships, not just with their own species, but other species and the land. And basically, when you take an animal and you rip them out, you're ripping out the fibers of their psyche. You're tearing them down terribly in that way. So how is it to diagnose it? Like I said, it's just easy. So for example, I mean, I can't, if I walk out and I see a bear, am I going to say, well, he has PTSD? No, I say there's a high probability that bear is traumatized.
You've been listening to a KPOV Critical Conversation. To hear more engaging interviews on important topics, please visit kpov.org/criticalconversations.